I'm Dr. Emily Carter, a board-certified urologist with over 12 years in clinical practice. I've spent a lot of that time correcting the misinformation men over 60 receive about sexual performance and pelvic floor function. Today, I want to give you what the clinical evidence actually says, not what the internet says, not what a friend told you, but what the research shows. Here's what I hear constantly from men in my clinic. They've tried the pills, they've tried the supplements, they've spent money on devices they found online at 2 in the morning. And they come into my office frustrated, embarrassed, and convinced that what they're experiencing is simply the unavoidable consequence of getting older. Here's what's wrong with that. Age is a variable. It is not a sentence. And the clinical evidence has been telling us for years that one of the most powerful interventions available to men over 60 for restoring strong, reliable performance costs nothing, requires no prescription, and can be done sitting in a chair. Most men have never heard of it, and the ones who have been told about it were given instructions so incomplete that they never saw results. Drop a comment right now and tell me what you've tried for performance issues. I want to know what's being recommended out there, because the misinformation on this topic is extraordinary. Now let me tell you what's actually going on. The most common mistake I see men over 60 make is assuming that what's happening between the sheets is a cardiovascular problem or a hormone problem and stopping the investigation there. And to be fair, blood flow matters. Testosterone matters. But here's what the clinical evidence shows that most conversations leave out entirely. The pelvic floor musculature, specifically the bulbocavernosus muscle and the ischiocavernosus muscle, plays a direct, measurable role in erectile rigidity and in the timing and force of performance. These muscles are responsible for compressing the deep penile veins during arousal, which is what maintains pressure and sustains rigidity. When those muscles are weak or poorly coordinated, which happens progressively after 50 due to reduced androgen stimulation, decreased neuromuscular signaling, and sedentary behavior, the hydraulic mechanism simply doesn't hold the way it used to. The plumbing may be fine, the pump may be weak. Here's what's wrong with how this gets treated. Men are either handed a phosphodiesterase inhibitor and sent home, or they're told their testosterone is low and given a cream. Both of those interventions address one piece of the picture. Neither one rehabilitates the muscular mechanism that determines what actually happens in the moment. And that is a massive clinical gap. Now let me walk you through the mistakes men make, and then I'm going to give you the evidence-based protocol, including exactly how the chair edge technique works and why the research supports it. Mistake number 1 is doing Kegel exercises the wrong way. Most men who've heard of pelvic floor training were told to squeeze and hold. That's it. Squeeze and hold. And when they didn't see results after a few weeks, they stopped. Here's what the research actually found. A landmark study out of the University of the West of England, conducted with 55 men over a period of 3 months, found that pelvic floor muscle training produced clinically significant improvements in erectile function, but only when the training protocol included both contraction and full deliberate release cycles, combined with functional integration into real movement patterns. The squeeze and hold approach, without the full release phase, trains the muscle into a chronically contracted state. That doesn't strengthen the pelvic floor. It fatigues it. The mechanism is straightforward. A muscle that cannot fully lengthen cannot fully generate force. You are not training strength. You are training tension. And tension is the opposite of what you need. Mistake number 2 is ignoring posture and hip position entirely. Gentlemen, this is where the chair edge technique enters the clinical picture. Here's what the research shows. The pelvic floor musculature does not operate in isolation. It operates as part of a system that includes the hip flexors, the deep hip rotators, the adductors, and the lumbar stabilizers. When men sit for extended periods, which is the reality for most men over 60, the hip flexors adaptively shorten, the posterior pelvic tilt increases, and the pelvic floor is placed in a chronically lengthened, low activation state. The muscles are there. They are simply switched off by the position you're spending most of your day in. A study published in the Journal of Urology examining pelvic floor electromyographic activity in men over 55 found that seated pelvic floor activation was significantly lower in men with posterior pelvic tilt compared to men positioned in neutral or anterior tilt. The difference wasn't anatomy, it was geometry. The chair edge technique corrects this geometry immediately. Here's how it works. Sit at the front edge of a firm chair, not a soft sofa, a firm chair. Move forward until only the back third of your thighs are supported. Let your knees drop slightly below your hips. Now, without leaning forward with your torso, allow your pelvis to tip forward, just slightly, until you feel a mild arch return to your lower back. You are not exaggerating a posture, you are restoring a neutral one. From this position, the pelvic floor is anatomically preloaded. The bulbocavernosus and ischiocavernosus muscles are in their optimal length-tension relationship. Now perform your contraction cycle from here. Contract deliberately, not a full force clench, a controlled 70% effort. Hold for 5 seconds, then release completely for 5 seconds. The release is not passive, it is active. You are consciously letting go. 10 repetitions, 3 times per day. That is the protocol the research supports. What most men feel on the first attempt from this corrected position is that they can actually feel the muscles working in a way they never could from a regular seated or lying down position. That is not coincidence. That is anatomy. Mistake number 3 is treating this as a standalone fix rather than understanding the full biological mechanism. Let me give you the complete picture, because this is where the clinical evidence gets genuinely interesting. A study conducted at the University of Florence involving 176 men with vasculogenic erectile dysfunction and an average age of 63 followed participants over a 6-month period, comparing pelvic floor rehabilitation against a control group receiving only lifestyle counseling. At the end of 6 months, 47% of the rehabilitation group had recovered what researchers classified as normal erectile function. An additional 34% showed significant improvement. The control group showed a 6% spontaneous improvement rate. These are men in their 60s. With vasculogenic dysfunction, meaning blood flow was already a documented factor, and nearly half of them recovered normal function through muscular rehabilitation alone. The mechanism is not mysterious. Stronger, better coordinated pelvic floor muscles compress the deep penile veins more effectively during arousal, which means higher intracavernosal pressure, which means greater rigidity, which means performance that feels like it used to. Mistake number 4 is neglecting the neurological component of the training. This one is subtle but clinically significant. Pelvic floor training is not just muscular training, it is neuromuscular training. The connection between your brain's motor cortex and your pelvic floor muscles degrades with age and with disuse, exactly the same way hand coordination degrades in someone who stops playing an instrument. The neural pathway atrophies. A 2019 study from Maastricht University Medical Center, examining 84 men between the ages of 58 and 71, found that men who incorporated what researchers called attentional focus, meaning they performed their contractions with deliberate, conscious attention to the specific muscles being activated, rather than performing them automatically, showed 31% greater improvement in pelvic floor strength measurements compared to men performing the same number of repetitions without focused attention. What that means practically is that doing these exercises while watching television or reading is significantly less effective than doing them with your full attention on the sensation of contraction and release. The brain-muscle connection is part of the treatment. You cannot outsource it. Mistake number 5, and this is the one that frustrates me most in clinical practice, is giving up after 2 weeks because results weren't immediate. Here's the clinical reality. Neuromuscular adaptation in the pelvic floor follows the same timeline as neuromuscular adaptation anywhere else in the body. The research consistently shows that meaningful improvement in erectile function from pelvic floor rehabilitation begins appearing at the 4 to 6 week mark, with the most significant gains occurring between weeks 8 and 12. The University of the West of England study I mentioned earlier showed peak improvements at the 12-week assessment. Men who dropped out before week 6 missed the window entirely and concluded the protocol didn't work. The protocol worked. The timeline was simply longer than their expectation. And that expectation was set by supplement advertising, not by science. Now let me give you the complete action plan supported by the research. Starting today, reposition for every seated pelvic floor session using the chair edge protocol I described. This is non-negotiable. Position determines activation, and activation determines results. Perform 3 sessions per day, 10 repetitions per session, 5-second contraction, followed by a deliberate 5-second release. Give each session your full attentional focus. No phone, no television, no distraction. The neuromuscular data is clear on this. Commit to a minimum of 8 weeks before drawing any conclusions about whether this is working. Mark the date. Put it in your calendar. The biology requires time, and impatience is the primary reason this intervention fails. Additionally, address the sedentary hip flexor shortening that is working against you the rest of the day. Every 60 to 90 minutes of sitting, stand and perform a 30-second hip flexor stretch on each side. This is not about fitness. This is about keeping the pelvic floor out of the chronic inhibition pattern that extended sitting creates. Gentlemen, you haven't been failing. You've been working with incomplete information. You were told to do Kegels without being told how position changes everything. You were told to squeeze without being told that the release is equally important. You were told this was an age problem when the clinical evidence shows it is, in large part, a training and geometry problem. Now you have the full picture. The mechanism is understood, the protocol is evidence-based, and the research is clear that men in their 60s, using the right approach, get real results. Tell me one thing you believed about performance and aging that this video changed. Drop it in the comments. I read them, and your experience helps me understand what information is missing for men navigating this. I'm Dr. Emily Carter. The clinical evidence shows that pelvic floor neuromuscular rehabilitation, performed in the correct anatomical position with deliberate attentional focus, produces measurable improvements in erectile function in the majority of men over 60 who follow the protocol consistently. And most men have never been given the complete picture until now. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.